just a brief note that I did send out an email to all of you with the prompts. If there's anyone who's not been getting the email, then you're not registered with the system. So, if you didn't get it, you really need to look into it. But it was sent out, I think, on Saturday evening, if I remember correctly, or maybe yesterday. But you should have enough of a choice there to be able to answer one of the, or write an essay on one of the particular prompts. And there's some material there which will be covered today and on Wednesday, because there are at least 2 or 3 questions which I don't think you're in a position to be able to attempt at the moment, but you should certainly be able to do that by the end of lecture on Wednesday, for the most part really by the end of lecture today. Now, my apologies, but I simply cannot take questions today. We're really substantially behind at this moment, but we will be able to recover ground if I'm just able to lecture straight through. We have a rather substantial agenda over here, as you can see, but some of this, covers terrain which I have really spoken about in passing or obliquely. Now, of course, I'm going to look at it in a much more substantive fashion. Now, in my concluding remarks to you on Friday, I've been speaking to you about India under British rule. And I pointed out to you that before the British came to India, that India had been ruled by what were called the Mughal emperors. The Mughal Empire existed in India for 2 to 3 centuries, depending on how you date it. And the significance of this, very simply, is that when the British came to India, they didn't really come into a vacuum. Very often, it's been represented as though they did come into a vacuum. Remember that one of the questions that we're going to attempt to understand, albeit very briefly, is how is it that the English who came to India as traders eventually became rulers? I don't think that the anomaly of that is palpably present to your mind until I give you the figures, which is that you're talking about at the height of British rule, fewer than 100,000 Englishmen in a country of several hundred million, right? That's what you have to think about. Now, the English had come to India, as I pointed out, in the early 1600s. They came as traders. At that point, of course, the Mughal Empire was at its height. It would continue to be for another 100 years, and the Mughal Empire was at that point almost without comparison. Almost. I mean, you've got the Safavids in Persia, you've got the Ottomans as well, but the Mughal Empire was certainly a very formidable empire of its day. Right? Now, that long history is something that we cannot enter into, but the critical thing is that the Emperor Aurangzeb is going to die in 1707, and one of the arguments that's been advanced is that after the death of the Mughal Emperor, so this is over here, the death of Aurangzeb, the Mughal Emperor, who had reigned for over 40 years, that at the death of Aurangzeb, the Mughal Empire is going to start to fragment. It's going to start to fragment. The English are going to take advantage of that. One of the ways in which they're going to take advantage of it is they're going to ally themselves with various Indian rulers, because they're going to be Indian rulers who are going to be now competing, all right, who are going to be competing for power. All of this covers terrain that we are not really looking at here. I've just given this to you as a slide, and I've posted it so that, for those of you who are interested, you can just simply get some sense of the chronology before we moved into 1757. Why 1757? Because that's when you have a battle which is called the Battle of Plassy, where an English army man, Major Robert Clive, he is going to defeat the ruler of Bengal. And at this battle, once he defeats the ruler of Bengal, the British are going to be in control of Bengal. Bengal is the eastern portion of India, subsequently, and again, these details are extraordinarily interesting if we were looking at it in detail, because if you just look at this over here, you're going to find that this is the name of the Indian Nawab, the Indian ruler, who was defeated by Clive. But as Nehru was going to argue, the British actually defeated him before he even arrived at the battlefield. Why? Because one of the things that the British did was they negotiated an agreement with his relative, negotiated an agreement with his relative Mir Jafar, okay? And when they negotiated that agreement with Mir Jafar, at that point, essentially the idea was that Siraj-ud-Daulah would be removed, right? So in other words, he was being betrayed, right? That's fundamentally what happened. Now, they have an agreement subsequently with another man called Mir Qasim, who is another relative. So Mir Jafar is going to be deposed, then Mir Qasim is going to be put in his place, then he's going to be deposed again, so forth and so on. The details, you don't need to concern yourself. What are we talking about? What we're talking about is the absolute lack of principles here, right? The British are simply saying, well, we're going to keep on negotiating with one ruler or another, so long as it's to our advantage. The gist of the matter is that they are going to become the sovereign power in Eastern India, the British, the sovereign power, right? And one of the ways in which this sovereignty is signified is that they become the rulers who have the right to collect the revenue, right? When I say collect the revenue, this is very significant, because how did an 18th century empire such as the Mughal Empire really survive? An 18th, 17th, 16th century empire? Well, one of the fundamental ways was the collection of land revenue, or land tax if you want to call it, right? So now the empire, the ruler of Bengal, he is responsible to the Mughal emperor who's sitting in Delhi. So if I can just draw a very rough sketch of India over here. Okay, so this is India, this is Bengal over here, and here you have the capital, okay, Delhi, which is where the Mughal emperor is seated. Now, various provincial rulers, such as ruler of Bengal, what they would have done is they would have collected the revenue, and they would have sent the revenue to the Mughal emperor. They keep a portion of the revenue for themselves, of course. And that's what all the other rulers are doing as well. Right? What's happened? When the British assume control, they have replaced the ruler of Bengal, and the East India Company, that's the company representing the British, and they are going to transmit the revenue to the Mughal emperor. Right? And then over a period of several decades, so this is what I mean by acquires the right to Diwani. 1765 Diwani is the right to collect the revenue and transmit the revenue. All right? And so essentially what's going to happen then over the course of the next several decades is that the British are going to be able to eventually consolidate the rule. First in the coastal regions. Recall that map I'd shown you on Friday, where I'd shown you that essentially the first British establishments are going to be in the coastal regions, and then slowly they are going to be able to make their way inland, and gradually, of course, all of India is going to fall under British rule. Right? Okay, so this is the general picture. It's kind of the backdrop, if I may put it this way. Okay, the backdrop. All right. Now, is somebody talking there or what? It's coming from there? Yeah. Okay, all right. It's a little distracting. All right, now the pillars of British rule in India. Okay, so when I say the pillars of British rule in India, what's a fundamental question here for us? The question is, how were the British able to establish and consolidate their rule? All right? And each of these I'm going to spend a couple of minutes on. Why? Because the larger theme that we need to think about is the theme of, go back to this question of the agenda for today. Colonialism in general, and colonialism and the politics of knowledge. And I'm going to explain, of course, what I mean when I say colonialism and the politics of knowledge. Right? So when we're speaking about the pillars of British rule, what we're fundamentally interested in is, how is it that the British were able to persuade the Indians that they are the rightful and legitimate rulers of India? And of course, somebody could easily contest it and say, well, they never did actually persuade the Indians, right? That they essentially held them down by force. But one of the things that I pointed out to you, so that you can immediately start giving an answer to that particular formulation, is that, well, it's really a very small number of Englishmen who are in India. A very small number of Englishmen. Now, of course, they did control the Indian army. So the East India Company had its armies. The armies were staffed mainly by Indians. All the foot soldiers, the main soldiers, were mainly Indians. And then in all of these colonial armies, that was quite typical. You made sure that the cavalry and the artillery were always in the hands of the Europeans, especially the artillery, right? For obvious reason, because if you put artillery in the hands of Indians and they turn around the cannon and they fire at the army itself, at their own army, well, that's obviously disaster. Right? You do not want to put artillery in the hands of the native soldiers. And usually the cavalry would be European too. As we're going to, over time, we're going to find that an increasing percentage of the cavalry will become indigenized too. But artillery was always in the hands of Europeans in every colonial army. All right? So the question is, here is, how did the British, who really are minuscule in number in comparison to the Indians, how were they able to establish a rule? And I'm saying to you that there's one standard answer which is given, that, well, they actually use military force, and I'm saying that's a little bit of a problem, and it's a little bit of a problem for the reason I've described, that the armies were largely comprised of Indians. Now we can complicate it, and that will take us to another subset of today's lecture. I want to bring that in at this juncture. Is it possible to argue that one reason why the British were able to colonize India is because the Indians did not think of themselves as a unified people? They did not think of themselves as a nation. Right? Is it possible to argue that? I mean, so for example, let's say hypothetically the United States was attacked by, let's say, North Korea or Russia or something like that. I mean, you could say that, well, yes, despite the fact that, as this room itself shows, that there are people here who are Japanese American, Indian American, Chinese American, white American, African American, so forth and so on. Notwithstanding all of that, that everyone in this room very likely thinks of herself or himself as an American. Right? And therefore, that if there was some kind of attack on this country, that people would say, well, I feel partial and loyal to this country, and I'm going to display my loyalty and patriotism, right? Now, I'm suggesting to you that we're going to have to think about what are the circumstances under which India became colonized by the British, because if you turn to the map of India, this rough and ready map, this area over here, Bengal, is Bengali speaking. If you go down south, there are 4 major languages: Tamil, Telugu, Malayalam, and Kannada. And as someone who comes from Delhi, I myself come from Delhi, and I'm a Hindi speaker, I don't know any of those 4 South Indian languages at all. I mean, my knowledge of German and French and Spanish is much better than my knowledge of those 4 South Indian languages. Right? If you look at the not just the linguistic diversity of India, but if you look at the religious diversity of India, I mean, India had been under the Mughal emperor, under Mughal Empire, and the Mughal Empire was a Muslim empire. These were Muslim rulers. Whether they always ruled as Muslims or not is a question that we don't need to entertain at the moment. Right? And you had a substantial presence of other religious groups in India as well over a long period of time. Right? So now, is it possible that the British were able to effect a conquest of India because India was never a nation? Because a nation, what does a nation do? It attempts to unify. It attempts to unify. So if you're a South Indian living over here, and you're a Tamil speaker, right, how is an Englishman necessarily more foreign to a Tamilian speaker than a speaker of Bengali or Oriya, another language spoken here in Eastern India? I think it's worthwhile asking. And that leads me to the essay which I want to start discussing now, and then I go back. So I hope you don't think of these that these are all different things. Because remember, the question is an overwhelming question. I mean, and it's a question that historians who have worked on India, for example, are still not certain how to answer, right? Which is that how is it that the British were able to effect their conquest of India? So what does Ernest Renan say in this essay that was written in the late 19th century, in the late 1800s? Ernest Renan is a French scholar, right? And the essay that was assigned to you is, what is a nation? That's the essay. What is a nation? So what does he do? Right? Now remember, by the way, that he's a Frenchman, right? So keep that in mind. What does he do? He says, okay, let's try to understand what are the bases on which we describe a people as forming part of a nation. Very often we say people who speak the same language, right, constitute a nation. Now what is his modus operandi? How does he operate in this essay? He'll give you a certain argument which looks very reasonable, and then he'll say, but I can falsify this argument. I can show that there are a great many exceptions to this. So if you say, for example, that a nation is a group of people who speak the same language, how would we falsify it? We can falsify it in several different ways. Let me give you two illustrations. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the United States, good portions of South Africa, right? South Africa has many languages, but the elites, shall we say, speak English, okay? All of these are English-speaking nations. We could add a few more. Right? They're all English-speaking, but they don't constitute one single nation. They don't constitute one single nation at all. And in fact, there's no geographical continuity because Australia and the United States are miles apart, thousands of miles apart, as are New Zealand and Canada. Right? That's one way you could falsify it. But even within a country, you can falsify it, because India, of course, is the most vivid example before your eyes, that there are a great many people who live there, speaking many different languages. The Constitution of India, by the way, there are 15 something constitutional languages in India. If you ever look at a banknote from India, you'll see that the denomination is written in 15 languages or more. Okay? And according to the census of India, there are over 900 languages in India. I'm not speaking about dialects. 900 languages in India. But we know that India is a nation state, not the same thing exactly as a nation. So you could say that there are many different nations within the nation state of India, possibly. That would be one way to look at it. But I'm saying that we could actually falsify, right, as Renan is pointing out. Then he says, in that particular essay, that what has been said of language must also be said of race. The United States being a very good example. There are people who come from many different racial backgrounds, but yet in some ways we say that this is obviously a nation. Right? So it cannot be racial uniformity that defines a nation. Of course, there is some element of truth, as Renan is suggesting in each of these arguments, because in some ways, let me put it to you as a provocation. I would claim that the United States, that white Americans have always thought that this was a nation for them to claim, right? And everyone else is kind of coming in later on, as it were. So, you know, that the real nature of the United States was defined by Anglo-Saxon population, right? And the same thing could be said, obviously, of Canada. So you could say that, well, you know, if you look at, I mean, and there are obviously nations which are a bit more homogeneous. I think one striking example might be Japan, right? Although even there are groups of people such as the Ainu, right, who are actually racially different, right? Racially different than most of the Japanese. But you could say that, well, Japan might furnish an example of a country which has achieved its unity as a nation partially through linguistic conformity and linguistic homogeneity, racial homogeneity, Although, as I said, in all of these cases, you know, there is a Korean population in Japan as well, right? Which actually has a fairly long history. Right? So, in general, however, I think you can see that it's going to be very easy to falsify the claim that race is what defines a nation. So, what is it that defines a nation, right? And what he's going to do here is he's going to say that, well, people will talk about common language, common race, common religion. That, I think, can be very easily falsified. India, again, is a striking illustration because 15% of the population is Muslim today. 15% is fairly significant, right? 3%, roughly 2 to 3% is Christian, 2 to 3% is Sikh. But then again, you can go to countries where you're going to find that religious diversity is exemplified in other ways. I mean, the United States may be predominantly a Christian nation, but we know that the percentage of Christians in the United States has been declining rapidly, and adherents of other religions are rising, right? Whether they're Buddhists or Muslims or Sikhs or Hindus, whatever the case may be. So this is what he's doing here. He's saying that, look, there are all these arguments about what constitutes a nation, but we can falsify all of these. And then he makes a number of observations that we need to be attentive to very briefly, and then I'm going to go back to the question of the British and their conquest of India, right? So he says, for example, towards the end of the piece, that, well, perhaps we can speak about a nation as having a soul, a spiritual principle. Right? Now, this is the land of mystification to me, if you ask me. It's a little bit like blood, by the way. I also find when people talk about blood, you know, this blood fetish always scares me a little bit. You know, what defines a people is, people who share a common blood. Well, I don't know what a common blood is, frankly, because, you know, you poke everybody and the blood's going to be goddamn red, I can tell you. It doesn't matter whether you're black or white or yellow or whatever the case may be. Right? I mean, these are forms of mystification and fetishism that we have to be a little careful about. And of course, he's saying that, a nation is a soul, a spiritual principle. Two things which, properly speaking, are really one and the same, constitute the soul, the spiritual principle. One is a past, the other is a present. And then you say to yourself, the past. Does this mean shared memories of the past? Well, what if you were an American Indian here? What would be your shared memories with white people? Right? Your shared memory might be that your people got slaughtered, and those people were the ones who were slaughtering you. Right? Is that the shared memory of the past? So you see, I think that we can continue to complicate this. Right? But I think what needs to be understood very clearly here is that he felt it imperative to tackle this question. Why? Because nationalism, in part, was becoming a major force at this point in time. Right? And one of the things that I think Renan wanted to do right away was to distinguish between bad nationalisms and good nationalisms. And you know, the bad nationalisms are always out there in the East, in Africa. Those are bad nationalisms. You know, the Balkans, where people, quote, have been, since time immemorial been slaughtering each other for no reason whatsoever. You know, that's the typical representation, according to the split between the good nationalisms and the bad nationalisms. Now, what is the relevance of all of this to the British conquest of India? Was the British conquest facilitated, aided by the fact that India or Indians didn't really think of themselves as a unified people at all? I think it's actually a plausible argument. Right? It's a plausible argument, which is another way of saying, and I'm going to put it to you in a real form. I mean, this could have been an essay question, but it's a complex way of thinking about it, and I'm going to just simply sort of offer it to you as a thought. When the British come to India, yes, among the British are the English, the Scots, and the Irish, but nevertheless, by and large, the British are much more homogeneous. They're much more homogeneous. I can't take any questions right now. Okay? They're much more homogeneous in comparison to the Indians. They all speak roughly the same language. Yes, I know there's Gaelic, I know, but Gaelic was already on its way out in places like Ireland and Scotland, all right? And of course, the cuisine was almost largely similar, right? English was, of course, the language that had really become common. And I want to remind you that even though the Irish were colonized by the English, which is the subject of Nehru's chapters, which I assigned to you, and we'll look at that very briefly when we go back to colonialism in general, that even though they were colonized by the English, the Irish were bedfellows with the English in the colonization of India. So even though the Irish themselves were colonized by the English, they had no compunction, no restraint whatsoever in helping the English colonize India itself. All right? So we are saying that much more homogeneous. It's, if I may put it this way, I'm going to suggest to you the English were actually very provincial. Very provincial. Now they come to India, which has bewildering variety, as it still does today. Right? And in some ways, India was a much more cosmopolitan culture. A much more cosmopolitan culture. So effectively, the English colonization of India is the triumph of provincialism over cosmopolitanism. Right? That's just an argument. We'll leave it aside for a moment. I want you to think about that argument. Now we go back to the details of this colonization of India by the British, beginning in the late 18th century, moving into the 19th century. So how is it that if they're very small in number, that they're able to establish and consolidate the rule? And one of the things I've said to you is that, well, actually from the point of view of a Bengali, for example, or a Hindi speaker in the north, I mean, the English were no more foreign than most of the other Indians were to them. You know, that would be one way of looking at it. You could also say that this is characteristic defeat of cosmopolitanism by a provincial people who are single-minded about what they really want to do in India. But if we get down to the details, I'm going to suggest that this is what we would have to think about. Number one, the British introduced this notion of fair play, the rule of law, and justice. Now, this doesn't mean that I think that the British were always offering justice to Indians, or that they were always adhering to the rule of law. You know that when an Englishman commits a murder of an Indian, in India, the jury would not consist of a single Indian. Because the idea was that, well, actually Indians should not be sitting on a jury because they don't really have a sense of justice. Of course, by the way, exactly the same argument apropos of African Americans in this country for a very long period of time. Right? So an Englishman who's going to kill an Indian, murder an Indian, is going to be tried by English laws in India by an all-white English jury, the assumption being you can rely upon an all-white English jury to deliver justice. It's like saying that a white person who killed an African American in the 19th century would be put on trial and would actually be convicted of killing an African American. The chances of that were zero, almost zero, I can tell you. Right? So you have something similar going on over here. So I'm saying that this is that is why I use the word rhetoric. The rhetoric. The British claimed that what distinguished them from all other Indian regimes, the entire political history of India was a history of despotism. And they are bringing the principles of the rule of law, and they're saying that Indians are greatly appreciative of that. All right? The rhetoric of rule and law, that we are going to bring some semblance of order in this country. Secondly, non-interference in religious and social affairs of the natives. So the East India Company did not permit until 1813, which is 50 years after the conquest of Bengal, did not permit Christian missionaries to proselytize in India. Why? Because the argument was that if we permit these missionaries to proselytize in India, the Indians are going to become disaffected. What makes a people upset is if their religious beliefs, customs, practices are being violated by someone else. And so if we don't interfere with their religion, it is the best guarantee that we will be able to continue as rulers unhindered. And again, I have to massively simplify, because, of course, that's why I put the end date of 1813, because after 1813, that's going to begin to change, right? But certainly from 1750s until 1813, that remained the norm. Improvement. One of the things that the British attempted to do was to actually bring in an ethos of improvement. Because what is all of this amounting to? What this amounting to is, how did they win? Let me use a different phrase. How did they win the confidence of the Indians? How did they make the Indians agree to the proposition that our rule here is good for you? And that's what we're really talking about. So one of the agendas that they had was the agenda of improvement, particularly, for example, the improvement in the condition of girls and women. You know, if there are certain kinds of liabilities from which women suffer in particular, certain kinds of oppressions from which women suffer in particular, we're going to attempt to try to remove some of these liabilities. You know, all right? And one of those was the abolition of sati. I mean, I really shouldn't be speaking about it because it's so complicated here, the abolition of sati, and it likely to lead to misinterpretation. But on the other hand, if I don't mention it, it would be the most glaring omission of the instance of improvement. What was sati? Sati was the practice of widow immolation. And to elaborate upon that, because that might still be a little opaque, what I mean by that, so in some parts of India, such as Bengal, and it must be understood that sati was not a widespread practice. It's not a practice that exists among millions of Indians. For example, in the year 1850, 15, 1816, 1817, 18, each of these years, what is the total number of satis? The total number of satis is between 600 to 1,000. So what happens in a sati? A woman is married. She might be a very young girl, because, of course, girls were married at very early ages at that point, right? And her husband dies. You know, he dies of fever, asthma, cobra bite, whatever the case might be. Then, when the husband body is being burned, because Hindus burn, right? They burn the dead. The woman, that is his widow, would step into the funeral pyre and sit in the funeral pyre, and herself would burn to death. That was called the rite of widow immolation. Okay? Practice of sati. And of course the British said, oh, this is barbarous. This is completely barbarous, and we need to do something, because after all, if we're ruling India, we have to civilize these people. Right? Now, I'm not going to mention the fact that, of course, in the 19th century, I'm not going to dwell upon it in any great detail, I can tell you that the condition of girls and women in England was not much better. Right? Just in case you're thinking that, well, you know, English women were really enjoying all the fruits of liberty. No, they were not enjoying all the fruits of liberty. For example, they had no access to education. If you read the diaries of coal miners, you find that many of these coal miners raped their own daughters, so forth and so on. All right? So we have to be quite, this is what I mean, that this can be a very dangerous illustration, because it immediately feeds all the stereotypes that one civilization might have about another civilization. But on the other hand, if we don't think about it, then we're not reflecting upon exactly what is it that the British are doing. So one of the things the British argued was, we have to improve the condition of the natives. And this is, of course, a major justification for colonialism everywhere in the world. It is a justification for the American invasion of Afghanistan in recent years. We need to save these brown women from whom? From brown men. That's what we need to save them from. And so we're going to go and we're going to bomb Afghanistan, right? Because frankly, you can't trust these people, these men in Afghanistan to take care of their own women, right? It's the same argument. The structure of the argument hasn't fundamentally altered in the last 200 years, I would argue. But this is what sati was, and the British are going to abolish it in their territories. I say their territories because, of course, they didn't rule all of India at this point in time. Their rule is expanding. In 1829, sati was abolished. This is part of the ethic of improvement, right? And then conquest of knowledge, which I'll turn to later on. That's a topic in itself. Indirect rule. Remember, what is this all part of? This is how is it that colonialism comes into place? How is it that the British are able to establish their rule, acquire a certain kind of legitimacy in the eyes of Indians, right? And of course, if we look elsewhere in the world, we're going to find variations of this. Right? You know, what did the French do in Algeria? What did they do in Vietnam? So forth and so on. But we're looking at one case study here. So one of the ways in which they were able to perpetuate their rule is through the process of what was called indirect rule, where they say to some of the small native rulers in particular, we are not really going to meddle in your domestic affairs. You don't have sovereignty. So the ruler of Hyderabad is over here, a little place over here. It's actually a big kingdom, but there's a city of Hyderabad as well, and then the state of Hyderabad was quite large all over here. So the ruler of Hyderabad might be told, well, you have jurisdiction over your own subjects, but you do not have sovereignty. Right? You do not have the right to go and sign a treaty with France or the United States or China or Japan or whatever. Right? So that you exist in a relationship of subordination to us, but what you do with your subjects in the areas of sanitation, education, public goods, this is up to you. Right? And this is a system of what is called indirect rule, and then of course they use the whole formula of divide and rule. You set one ruler against another, right? That was one of the pillars of British rule. Now, the British, over a period of 100 years, 1857 is the timeline up till here, for the reason that in 1857 you're going to have a huge rebellion. Right? And so we're going to turn to that later on in a subsequent lecture when we look at the rebellion of 1857, because that will be the other half of the story, the rise of nationalism, right? The rise of nationalism, in some sense. Although whether the 1857 and 58 rebellion should be called a nationalist rebellion at all is certainly open to question. But resistance, anti-colonial resistance. However, 1757 to 1857, what you have is the transformation of India in nearly every sense of the term by the British. This is I did a 2-quarter course on just this. So what you're getting is a 10-minute capsule summary of something that is a 2-quarter course, essentially. Right? Some of this I have already addressed. For example, social, notion of improvement, sati. Right? This is one of the ways in which they're transforming India. I want to pay very close attention, comparatively speaking, to one element, and that is the conquest of knowledge. Now, let me explain to you. You see, typically, when you look at colonialism, most people understand it as a system of political domination and economic exploitation. And of course, it has a territorial aspect. Now, things are changing. So, there's a very recent literature of the last 2 decades on America and empire. Because, for example, the United States does not have an empire in the sense in which Great Britain had an empire, or France had an empire. If you remember those slides I showed you of how increasingly large parts of the world came under colonial rule, and we've all heard of the British Empire and the French Empire. And we know, of course, that the United States had hegemony in places such as the Philippines, in Cuba for a while, right? But on the whole, people do not speak of an American empire in the same way. So this is a complicated question about whether, for example, we can speak of an American empire today, right, in a different fashion, that empires do not take the shape that they did, of course, in the 19th century. Here we're looking at the 19th century, 18th century, late 18th century, moving into the 19th century. And I'm saying to you that typically this is how colonialism would be looked at. Political domination, economic conquest, and both of these have a territorial aspect, right? That there's an occupation of a country by the colonizing power. And then that economic relationship may take various forms. It takes one very concrete form, and that has variations. And that is obviously, for example, one would be that you take the raw materials from these countries that you have colonized, you ship them over to the colonizing power, right? And these raw materials are then used to manufacture goods, which you may then send back to the colony, and you may force the colony to buy at very high rates. Right? That would be one simple model if you wanted to look at how economic exploitation might possibly work. There were very complicated ways in which it worked. In India, before I turn to the conquest of knowledge, just to give you a little illustration of the other manifestations of economic exploitation, in India there was something called home charges. Home charges, right? And what do I mean when I say home charges? So home charges are, and I'll give you two illustrations of what these home charges were. So in the early 20th century, when World War I took place, 1914 to 1918, now India, when Britain goes to war, India is a British colony. What are the implications? India is also at war now with Germany. And 56,000 Indian soldiers were going to die in World War I. Over 1 million were going to serve in the war. Okay? Now, where are their salaries coming from? Where are their salaries coming from? They're coming from India. Why should they be coming from India? If you were a nationalist, you would say, why are these salaries coming from India? We're not fighting this war for the protection of India. We're fighting this war on behalf of the British Empire. Why is Britain not paying these soldiers' salaries? Right? These salaries had to be paid from revenues earned in India itself. And of course, it's a considerable drain on Indian revenues. A very considerable drain. If you have to pay 1 million soldiers, right? This is what is called home charges. A second illustration of home charges, when the railways were brought to India, this was the first instance of British capital being actually invested in India. Right? So when the railways were brought, the British investors were told, we'll give you a guaranteed 5% return on your investments annually. Right? So if you're an Englishman, you purchase a stock in one of these railway companies for £100, you're guaranteed £5 return on that. Even if the railway company is going in debt, where is that £5 coming from? It's coming from Indian revenues. Right? These are what were called home charges. And of course, the Indian nationalists late in the 19th century began to be highly agitated because they said, well, this is an illustration of how we are being bled. Right? However, I want to suggest to you the most potent form of colonization is a colonization of the mind. And that is, if that is a colloquial way of speaking about the conquest of knowledge. When the British came to India, they brought with them a certain conceptual apparatus by which they viewed the world, by which they understood the natural world, by which they understood social and economic relations between people, the nature of social institutions. They had a conceptual apparatus, and what they sought to do was to introduce this conceptual apparatus in India. That's what colonizing powers do. Right? Over a period of time, the British produced a massive corpus of texts having to do with Indian society, Indian religion, Indian languages. They created dictionaries, right, of several Indian languages, grammars of all of these languages. They wrote histories, they wrote geographies, they surveyed the land, then they would write survey reports. They created a whole apparatus for the surveillance of the Indian population. They created institutions such as the Archaeological Survey of India, the Botanical Survey of India, the Geological Survey, the Trigonometrical Survey, so forth and so on. That's what they did. They created a massive body of knowledge. The idea was to supplant the native, the indigenous conception of knowledge with their own conception of the world, right? Because in a sense, and that will bring me to the document that was assigned to you, and it is with my interpretation of this document that I'm going to close my lecture for today, and that is Macaulay's Minute on Indian Education. Now, what is the context for this, and who is Macaulay? So Macaulay is a member of the government of India. He's a very high-ranking official. And in 1835, he writes this little document. It's called Minute. Minute is a term which means an official document. A Minute on Indian Education, 2nd February 1835. Now this document becomes crucially significant. Let me begin by simply telling you a very simple fact and then moving to the document. While the English were in India, the language of administration in India was, guess what? And does anybody here know the language of administration in India until 1835, before the Minute? Persian. Persian, which is not even an Indian language, because the Mughal emperors used Persian. So even though the Mughal Empire had gone into decline, the British have now become the sovereign rulers gradually, they're still using Persian. That's the official language of administration. Of course, they're using English widely too. Now, one of the things that the Minute did was it basically sent Persian into oblivion in India. But the most significant thing about the Minute is what? At this point in 1835, the government of India has now become really the sovereign ruler. The British government of India, the British have become the sovereign rulers. They have to make a decision. One decision is, how are they going to spend their money with respect to the question of the education of the natives? Because every state, I mean, that is an obligation of a state right now, right? If you're living in this country, you know, that's if if you ever get a property tax bill, look at your parents' property tax bill, and it'll give you a breakdown, and it'll tell you what percentage of it is going towards the district school, right? That is an obligation of a state. And of course, the colonial state felt that it had some obligation to the Indians. The question was, how do we spend this money? Do we spend it on educating the natives in Arabic, Persian, and Sanskrit? And what does Macaulay, he says these languages, bunch of rubbish. That's what he says. He says all of the literature of the Orient, the entire Orient, right? The Arabic-speaking world, the Persian-speaking world, he doesn't really talk much about the Japanese and Chinese and all of that, but all of India, the entire literature of the Orient is not equivalent to one shelf of good European literature, particularly English literature. So Macaulay's recommendation, which will become the policy of the British government in India, was that henceforth all public funds are going to be used to educate Indians in English. Now, of course, we don't have the time here to address, because this is not a course of British India, we don't have time here to address what are all the problems there. If you're going to educate them in English, do we have the textbooks in English? Do Indians know any English at all? the vast bulk of them. I mean, yes, there's a minuscule 0.001% of the population which has some knowledge of English, but how are you going to introduce English, right? That is going to be the agenda. And what does Macaulay say? Concluding remark. What does he say? He says, the intention is to create a class of Englishmen in India who are English in feeling, in taste, in opinion, in intellect. They can't be English in blood and color. It's going to be very difficult to pass off a dark-skinned Dravidian from South India as an Englishman. But hey, if this person quotes Shakespeare fluently, thinks like an Englishman or an Englishwoman, right? We have done our task. We have really colonized these people if we can create such a class of people, because this class of people will also be a class of people who will be intermediaries between us and the Indian masses. Right? This is what he's saying. That after, effectively what he's saying is, after the last Englishman has left the soil of India, right? He's not saying this, but this is what he's implying. After the last Englishman has left the soil of India, because one day they will. He knows. They're not going to be staying there forever, but after the last Englishman has left the soil of India, we're not needed there anymore. Because the Indians are thinking like us. Right? Their aesthetic tastes, their feelings, their opinions are like our aesthetic tastes, feelings, opinions. That is what it means to be colonized. All right, I'm going to resume on Wednesday.